What if the most powerful revival in the Catholic Church today isn't happening on a stage and a headline or through a viral campaign, but in silence? What if the healing of the Church isn't being led by grand speeches or sweeping reforms, but by a man who cries with strangers, fixes broken rosaries with a string from his pocket, and walks barefoot into forgotten places? This is the untold story of Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, the shepherd who was never chosen as Pope, yet chosen by something far greater. The cries of the people and the whisper of the Spirit stay with us, because the journey you're about to hear might just change how you see the Church and how you see holiness itself. Now, let us take you into the story in the sacred hush of the Vatican, where even footsteps seem to echo eternity. Something quietly unexpected unfolded. There were no trumpet fanfares, no press briefings, no papal declarations broadcast to the world, just one line, almost unnoticeable, tucked into the middle of the daily. Vatican Bulletin. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle has been entrusted with a new mission that was at no elaboration, no photos, just a sentence. But for those who still believe in the language of the Spirit, that sentence struck like a bell in the soul. It began with a ripple, not a wave, not the roaring kind of Vatican drama that makes headlines, but a slow, burning murmur, first in Rome's inner corridors and across dioceses and among parishioners sipping coffee. After Mass, the ripple drifted east to Manila, south to Lagos, north to Krakow, west to Los Angeles, and wherever it traveled, something stirred. Tears welled up unexpectedly, hands pressed against rosaries more tightly, and whispers of thanksgiving escaped old lips that had not prayed so deeply in years. He's back. They said he was called back. No one really knew what the appointment meant. There was no title attached, no explanation. But it didn't matter. People didn't need definitions. They understood the meaning in their bones. This wasn't nostalgia. This wasn't ceremony. This was something sacred. The ones who had watched Cardinal Tagle fade from the headlines after the 2025 conclave had felt a grief that was never quite spoken aloud. He had once stood on the threshold of the papacy, his name spoken in whispers, his face on magazine covers, his sermons quoted in seminaries. But when the white smoke rose and another man stood on the Lodeo, the world turned its gaze elsewhere. Tagle, it seemed, had been left behind, or so people thought. What they didn't see was that while others rushed into the limelight, Tagle had chosen to step into the shadows. He didn't protest the decision of the conclave. He didn't give interviews. He didn't try to stay visible. He returned quietly to the margins of the Church, not out of resignation, but out of reverence. He returned to what he had always done, sitting with the poor, praying with the grieving, listening to the broken, and in the silence that followed, something deep began to take root. Now, in the stillness of Rome, the Church was listening again, and the voice it heard wasn't loud, it was tender, it was full of tears. It was a voice that didn't call for power, but for presence. Pope Leo XIV had chosen him not for his eloquence or visibility, but for the fire he had kept hidden and alive. It wasn't strategy, it wasn't politics. It was the summit, the kind of slow, painful listening that only comes from prayer, and in prayer the Pope had heard one name come back again, and again: Luis Antonio Tagle. No announcement explained what new mission meant, but in the small parishes of France, where mass attendance had withered, in the Amazon basin, where lay missionaries struggled with exhaustion, in the urban slums of Manila, where tricycles zipped past crumbling chapels, the message was unmistakable. A shepherd had been called not to govern, but to walk again, not to rule, but to accompany the corridors of Vatican power, always alert to optics exchanged. Glances, a few eyebrows raised, a few advisors muttered about optics and precedent, but no one protested, because even the most cynical had to admit absence from authority hadn't made him irrelevant. It had made him holy in the United States among older Catholics who remembered Vatican II, and the gentle fire at once carried the news of Tagle's reappearance, brought something they had almost forgotten: hope. He reminded them of a time when the Church felt close, not perfect, but present, not efficient, but loving. His tears, public, unashamed, had once startled people, but now they felt like something they had missed for too long in an age of statements. He was a prayer back in Manila. His name was spoken not with fanfare, but with familiarity. Seto. They still called him Cardinal Seto, not your eminence. But our brother in Church's candles were lit not in protest, but in thanksgiving, not because of what he had been appointed, but because he had not been forgotten, because his return meant the poor were not invisible, that someone had remembered their names. At a youth center in Cebu, a group of college students gathered in prayer. One of them whispered, "I thought he was gone, but God doesn't forget his shepherds." At a small chapel in a fishing village devastated by a typhoon, a grandmother wept while holding a photo of him. "He smelled like us." She said, "Simply he walked with us." And so the world, in its own quiet way, began to turn toward this new undefined moment. No speeches had been given, no plan unveiled, but in chapels and dining rooms and sacries and seminaries, people were asking the same thing: what happens now, what happens when a man who was once passed over is now being asked to return not to the throne but to the road? What happens when the church rediscovers its heart, not in the system, but in a man who cries when others are in pain? What happens when a pope listens not to politics, but a prayer? No one could answer those questions yet, but they knew where to look, and they knew who would walk ahead of them gently, quietly, like a candle lit in the dark. The whisper had begun, and the church, long weary from noise, was finally listening. You stayed with us and are listening to our story. We are truly grateful. We hope to bring you a blessed day and send you our warmest wishes from the Lord and Pope Leo XIII. Join us as we uncover the powerful message in the next part of the story. And don't forget to subscribe and leave your wonderful comment below. Thank you so much. After the white smoke drifted into the Roman sky in 2025, signifying the election of a new pope, the world turned its attention to the name announced: Pope Leo XIV. The cameras panned across St. Peter's Square, searching for the reactions of the men once thought to be front-runners. One camera paused on the face of Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle. His eyes were not surprised, they were peaceful. Then, quietly, the cameras captured a single tear falling down his cheek. He wept, but not because he had lost something. He wept because he had loved the church deeply enough to let go. In the days that followed the conclave, others called family gave interviews and returned to their dioceses. With renewed prominence, Cardinal Tagle returned to his chapel. There were no statements issued, no theological reflections released to the press. Instead, he went back to his quiet rhythm prayer presence. And people, for many in the church, it felt like he had vanished. But he hadn't disappeared. He had descended not into obscurity, but into intimacy. In Manila, where he had once served as archbishop, the people felt his absence, like an 8 grandmothers still mention him during mourning. Rosary Street vendors would sometimes pause and look toward the cathedral as if hoping he might walk by again. Children still remember the day he sat on the church steps to talk with them, not above them. He had never made people feel small. He had always met them where they were. He did not seek public platforms. After the conclave invitations came conferences, television specials, academic lectures, but he declined them all, not with disdain, but with the summit: "I must go where the Lord whispers," he once told a close friend, and those whispers never led him to stages. They led him to shadows. In the months that followed, Cardinal Tagle became almost invisible in the global Catholic conversation. Commentators assumed he had retired into symbolic duty. Vatican analysts stopped mentioning his name. They called him a relic of a lost moment. But they were wrong, because while others were busy performing, he was busy praying. While others sought to be seen, he sought to see, and in the quiet places where suffering still lived, he was there. In a coastal village in the Philippines devastated by a typhoon, he spent nights on a bamboo mat beside a makeshift chapel. He held hands with fishermen who had lost their boats and with mothers who had lost their children. He didn't give speeches. He listened. He didn't promise miracles. He sat with their grief. One night, after celebrating Mass under a tarpaulin roof, an old woman approached him and said, "You came back even though you're not the Pope." He smiled gently and replied, "I never left you." In Africa, he visited a leprosy center that hadn't received a high-ranking church visitor in decades. He ate rice from a metal plate. Sitting in a circle with the patients, one man asked him, "Are you really a cardinal?" He looked at his cassock, then shrugged. "I'm just a brother who wanted to see you." In Latin America, he quietly joined missionaries working in drug-plagued neighborhoods. They didn't expect him to stay long, but he stayed for days, walking alleys, praying with families visiting prisons. "He's not a guest," one catechist whispered, "he's one of us." There was something unshakable in his presence, not an authority, but an authenticity, and it didn't go unnoticed forever. In Vatican corridors, a few insiders whispered that he hadn't faded at all. He had been refined. "He is more priest now than ever," one bishop confided. "He carries no agenda, but the gospel." He became a spiritual father to those who had no spotlight. Young priests wrote to him. Struggling missionaries sought his counsel. A seminarian from Vietnam who had almost left his vocation recalled meeting him at a retreat. "I told him I wasn't holy enough," the young man said. "He looked at me and said, 'Then let God be holy through you.'" I stayed despite his growing influence among forgotten. Cardinal Tagle never reclaimed a seat of power, and even when he had no desire to be center stage, when journalists did try to reach him, he politely declined. In one rare response he wrote, "It's not time for microphones, it's time for mercy." Back in the Philippines, his name remained on the lips of the poor. He was never far from them. He walked among street vendors, tricycle drivers, market workers. He ate in humble homes, remembered people's names, birthdays, and griefs. He attended funerals of those no one else came for. His schedule was never fully known, because he never treated himself as important to him. It was the people who carried the weight of heaven in Rome. Pope Leo XIV watched quietly, prayerfully. He never forgot what he had seen. In the conclave, Tagle's face had surrendered the way. He had wept not out of loss, but out of love. The Pope had always been a man of silence, but in his silence, he noticed everything, and Tagle was not forgotten. He was being prepared. One evening, the Pope said to one of his closest aides, "There's a man who wasn't chosen, but who carries the soul of this church." The aide asked, "Do you mean Cardinal Tagle?" The Pope smiled but said nothing, because some truths don't need confirmation. They just need time, and time was what Tagle had embraced. He no longer measured his days and achievements, but in encounters, he believed that greatness in the church was not about position. It was about proximity. He once said during a private retreat, "If we forget how to walk slowly with the one who suffers, we forget how to walk with Christ." In a church weary of noise, divided by politics, and wounded by scandal, a quiet shepherd moved among our people like a soft breeze. He had no plan, he had no platform, but he carried something few others had: a heart still open, still breakable, still burning. They called him forgotten, but heaven had remembered, and it was only a matter of time before the church would. You stayed with us and are listening to our story. We're truly grateful. We hope to bring you a blessed day and send you our warmest wishes from the Lord and Pope Leo XIV. Join us as we uncover the powerful message in the next part of the story. And don't forget to subscribe and leave your wonderful comment below. Thank you so much. Today, Pope Leo XV was elected. Many around the world were confused. He was not the front-runner. He had not been mentioned in pre-conclave predictions or Vatican shortlists. He was quiet, measured, and known more for his long silences and for any charismatic flair. The announcement stunned journalists and curial officials alike. They searched for clues in his past speeches and his former diocesan work, but found little. He had lived in the margins of the ecclesiastical world, humble, observant, unknown to most. But what the world could not grasp, those who truly listened to God understood. Well, the Holy Spirit had chosen a man of prayer from the very first days of his papacy. Pope Leo XIV didn't move the church with declarations. He didn't issue sweeping reform statements. He didn't convene large Vatican councils or reorganize the Curia with thunderous authority. Instead, he moved like a monk inside the Vatican. He spent long hours in the chapel. He met with people quietly, one by one. He visited the sick, the dying, the janitors, the gardeners. When a diplomat from a powerful nation tried to present a policy agenda, Leo responded with a parable and an invitation to pray. Many called him indecisive. Others whispered that he was weak, but a few began to see it for what it was: discernment. It was during one of those long prayer vigils that a name returned to the Pope's heart: Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle. It didn't arrive with a flash of inspiration or a prophetic dream. It came like a breath, soft and persistent at first. He dismissed that the world had moved on from Tagle. He hadn't been in the news for years. His public voice had faded, but still the name returned, and with it a memory. Leo remembered the moment from the conclave. It had been late in the evening. Tensions were high. Discussions were heavy. Cardinals were still deliberating behind closed doors. In the middle of it all, Cardinal Tagle had spoken not with passion, but with fragile reverence. He had spoken about the people, about the wounds of the church, about the need to be a shepherd who didn't manage from above, but who cried beside the wounded. It wasn't a speech. It was a prayer wrapped in flesh. Most had forgotten it. Leo hadn't, since becoming Pope. Leo had received hundreds of recommendations from advisors, each with plans for reform, suggestions for appointments, and strategies to address the church's challenges, but none of them felt like He answered the church didn't need more plans, it needed presence. And one night, while kneeling before the tabernacle, Leo finally admitted it to himself. The answer was not in Rome. It was walking among the poor, fixing broken rosaries, praying in silence across distant lands. The answer was Tagle. He didn't summon him through official Vatican protocol. There was no sealed envelope or formal courier. He asked to meet him personally. He sent word through a quiet channel, a whisper through the folds of trust. And on the other side of the world, in a village ravaged by typhoon winds, Cardinal Tagle received a message. At the time, Tagle had been sleeping in a small bamboo chapel with no walls and a half-collapsed roof. He had just celebrated Mass under the open sky using a makeshift altar and wine donated from a local grocer night. Before he held the hand of a grieving mother who had lost her son to the flood, he had listened to a fisherman describe his lost boat not as a possession but as part of his soul. That was when a call from Rome came. The villagers offered to prepare a send-off, but Tagle gently declined. He stayed one more night. He celebrated one more Mass, and only after blessing the children and thanking the elders did he leave quietly under morning sun. The flight to Rome was long, but Tagle spent most of it in prayer, not the urgent kind, but the still kind that listens more than speaks. He didn't know why he was being called. He didn't ask, he simply opened his heart. When he arrived at the Domus Sancti, there was no red carpet, just a modest room, and a familiar chapelist sister at the front desk greeted him as if he had never left welcome home. She said softly the next morning as the sun broke through the Vatican gardens. Pope Leo XIV entered the small room where Tagle waited. They embraced not as Pope and Cardinal, but as brothers. They sat in silence for several moments. Then Leo spoke. "I don't bring you a title," he said. "I bring you a mission." Tagle looked at him, quiet but attentive. "I've been watching the church from the margins." The Pope continued. "The noise is louder than ever. The wounds are deeper. People are not leaving because they stop believing in God. They're leaving because they don't recognize Him in us anymore. They're longing for shepherds who cry with them, who kneel beside them, who stay." There was a pause. "I believe you are that shepherd." Tagle didn't respond immediately. He folded his hands. His mind flashed back to the old man in Marseilles who whispered, "You brought Jesus." And the girl in Lisbon who had drawn a picture of him holding a candle beneath stars. He remembered the broken rosary, in Lourdes the laughter of orphans, in Uganda the silence of a nun, in Vietnam. Slowly he looked up and said, "Wherever I'm needed, Holy Father, even if it's the smallest corner." The Pope smiled. That was enough. They didn't outline a strategy. They didn't draft objectives or sign agreements. They simply prayed, two men kneeling in silence, not seeking power, but presence, not crafting reform, but remembering the mission. When Tagle left the meeting, he didn't prepare a press statement. He didn't notify journalists. He packed his small bag like a pilgrim and returned to his chapel. He whispered the same prayer he had said for decades here. "I am Lord, I come to do your will." Back in the Vatican, no one rang bells, but something holy had been set in motion. Not a promotion, not a campaign, but a call. And the one who had been forgotten by headlines was about to help the church remember its soul. Cardinal Tagle began his mission the way he had always done. Everything with humility, silence, and a suitcase that held more prayer than plans. There were no press releases or public events marking his first steps, no grand announcements. Just one simple departure from Rome and a quiet arrival in a place no one expected, a worn-down parish on the edge of trust. It was a kind of Roman neighborhood where tourists came for pizza and locals came to survive. The church was old, cracked at the corners, and its priest was young and weary. Tagle didn't knock at the rectory door in clerical robes. He didn't arrive with assistants or photographers. He slipped into the back pew during a weekday mass and prayed with the people, immigrants, widows too, homeless men, and a tired mother with 3 children. After mass, he waited at the side door until the young priest came out. "My name is Luis," he said gently. "May I join you for lunch?" The priest blinked, unsure if this was a joke, then nodded. They ate bread and soup at the rectory kitchen table. No wine, no speeches, just conversation. That afternoon, the priest shared his struggles. "I don't know if I'm helping anyone," he admitted. "It feels like no one listens anymore." Tagle didn't give him a strategy. He gave him silence. He listened like someone who understood what it felt like to pour your soul out week after week into pews that felt increasingly empty. At the end of the meal, Tagle looked him in the eye and said, "Keep the doors open even when no one comes, especially then." The priest wept. That's how it began. From that hidden Roman parish, Cardinal Tagle quietly moved outward. He traveled not by Vatican schedules, but by discernment. He didn't choose his destinations based on influence or statistics. He went where the Spirit pointed, usually to the places most had forgotten. His second visit was to a school run by religious sisters in North Africa. The school served orphans and poor children. The sisters hadn't seen a cardinal in over a decade. They didn't expect one now. When he arrived, they didn't even recognize him. He sat with them in the courtyard, shared tea, asked about their joys before he asked about their needs, one sister later recalled. "He made us feel like the church saw us again. There were no inspections, no photos, no directives, only presents from there." He moved again to refugee centers, prisons, small chapel hospitals in Argentina. He knelt beside catechists who worked in villas plagued by drug violence in Poland. He listened to factory workers who whispered about the underground masses they had once attended under communist rule in Canada. He sat with indigenous elders, still healing from the wounds inflicted by institutions that claimed to carry the name of Christ. He came without answers. He carried no clipboard. What he brought was a holy ache of readiness to feel with those who no longer trusted anyone who wore a collar. In a world obsessed with results and metrics, Tagle moved slowly. Deliberately, he didn't count baptisms or conversions. He counted moment of grace, the kind that happened when someone finally felt heard in Uganda. He visited a mission school Where many of the students were former child soldiers, the children didn't understand who he was. They saw an old man who knelt when they prayed and smiled like their grandfather. One child gave him a hand-woven bracelet. He wore it for weeks and evenings. He would sit alone in a chapel and cry not tears of despair, but of communion. If we cannot cry, he once told a group of missionaries, and we have stopped listening in his travels. He asked nothing. He didn't expect red carpets or addresses. He rarely told the local bishops he was coming. Sometimes he stayed in guest houses, sometimes in convents, sometimes on wooden floors with rolled blankets. When asked what he needed, he always gave the same reply: a chapel and a cup of hot water. The Vatican press office didn't issue updates on his visits. That was never the point, but slowly the word spread. Anyway, not in the newspapers, but in hearts on parish bulletin boards. People began printing out grainy photos of him praying with a street vendor or blessing a child. He wasn't being followed by cameras. He was being remembered in Brazil. He joined a choir of barefoot children in a fava church with bullet holes in the walls in Japan. He sat a hidden mass in a farmhouse, worshiping with Catholics whose ancestors had practiced their faith in secrecy for centuries. In India, he broke bread with Hindu and Muslim leaders and spoke not about doctrine, but about dignity. He said, "Compassion is not a strategy, it's a language of survival." Everywhere he went, people leaned in, not because he spoke loudly, but because he spoke with love. His words were few, but his presence was full in dioceses across the world. Bishops began to take notice, not because he issued instructions, but because they saw the fire in people's eyes. After he left, seminaries began dusting off forgotten documents on pastoral formation. Young priests watched videos of his homilies, not to copy the content, but to learn the tone, the way he made truth feel like an embrace. Back in Rome, Pope Leo XIV remained quiet, but watchful. He didn't interfere. He didn't send directives. He simply prayed and received occasional letters from Tagle. One letter arrived after a trip to Myanmar. In it, Tagle wrote, "I visited a woman who had lost her son in violence. She held a crucifix in one hand and my hand in the other. She said, 'Now I remember that God suffers with us.' I didn't know what to say. I just cried." The Pope kept that letter in his breviary, and so the mission continued, not in programs, but in presence, not in initiatives, but in incarnation. Cardinal Tagle had become what the Church had forgotten. It needed a man who moved not by power, but by love. He didn't go to fixed dioceses. He went to revive hearts in kitchens and chapels in jungles and suburbs and slums, and seminaries. Of fire was quietly spreading, not the fire of controversy, the fire of communion. It began not with applause, but with a whisper, and now wherever he went, that whisper turned into something holy. In a church long accustomed to voices booming from pulpits and platforms, Cardinal Tagle's mission stood apart, not because of what he said, but because of what he did. He wasn't building movements or organizing campaigns. He was doing something older, something deeper. He was showing up. He was listening. And in his silence, something began to stir within communities that had grown tired of being taught, that they began to believe again. It happened first in a small parish tucked between the tin rooftops of a Manila slum. Tagle arrived unannounced, stepping over puddles and ducking under tangled wires. He wore a plain shirt, carried no entourage, and greeted the volunteers by name. They were preparing a modest meal for the elderly, a bowl of rice and a hard-boiled egg. Tagle asked if he could help. They gave him a ladle. For the next hour, he served food, made quiet conversation, and smiled the way only someone who had known hunger could. No speeches, just presents. Later that afternoon, a young catechist approached him with trembling hands. "I've tried everything," she confessed: posters, concerts, videos, social media. "But no one comes to our classes anymore. They don't care." Tagle didn't respond immediately. He looked around at the small church with peeling paint and crooked pews. He sat down, invited her to sit beside him, and said softly, "Then don't start with lessons, start with listening. Before they hear about Jesus, they need to know they've been heard." That was his method, not innovation, but incarnation, not persuasion, but presence. He believed that evangelization wasn't performance, it was communion. He often said, people don't want to be saved by strangers, they want to be seen by friends. His style wasn't loud, but it was unforgettable. In a church tempted by grand productions, he returned to what was personal. In a quiet chapel in Uganda, Tagle prayed beside survivors of war and disease. One man whose entire family had been lost to conflict told him, "I no longer pray aloud. God doesn't need my words." Tagle nodded and replied, "Then let your tears be your prayer." They sat in silence for over 30 minutes. No one moved, no one needed to. In that stillness, something passed between them, sacred, unspoken, healing. It was this kind of witness that began to attract the attention of missionaries around the world. Not because he was proposing new theology, but because he was returning them to their first love in a gathering of lay leaders in Argentina. He was asked how to reach people in neighborhoods plagued by violence and despair. His answer was simple: don't come with solutions, come with soup, sit, stay, let them teach you first, one young missionary whispered later. He gave me permission to be human again. And yet for all his quiet, Tagle knew when to speak, and when he did, his words felt like they came from the marrow in a retreat for young priests in Poland. One asked him nervously, "Cardinal, what do we do when we feel like we're preaching to walls?" Tagle smiled, gently closed the priest's Bible, and said, "Then stop preaching, start weeping. The gospel doesn't shout, it bleeds." The room fell into silence. A few wiped their eyes. No one took notes. They were living the note. What surprised people most was how approachable he remained in every setting: rural villages, city streets, mountain parishes. He greeted people like old friends. He knelt to speak with children, kissed the hands of elderly women, and took his meals beside the janitors. A group of seminarians in Colombia once invited him to lunch, expecting a short visit. He stayed for hours, asking them questions, listening to their doubts, sharing his own. "When I was your age," he told them, "I thought holiness meant perfection. Now I know it means proximity, being close enough to carry someone else's sorrow." One story spread quickly through the mission communities. In Lourdes, a woman's rosary had snapped in her hands while she was lighting a candle for her dying husband. Beads scattered across the cold stone floor. No one moved to help except one man. Tagle knelt without a word and began gathering the beads. He found them beneath benches and near the altar. He pulled a small string from his pocket and rethreaded them, tying a firm knot. Then he handed them back and whispered, "Your prayers are never broken," not in his eyes. The woman wept later. She would tell others, "I don't remember his name, but I saw Christ that day fixing my rosary with string." In the days and weeks that followed, people began bringing broken rosaries to churches in the area. Volunteers started fixing them, quietly threading beads, saying prayers. They called here the Rosary Revival. But Tagle never claimed credit. He never even mentioned again. That was his way. He planted sparks and let the Spirit fan the flame everywhere. He went the same thing happened. People stopped waiting for answers. They started listening to one another. In Tagle, a pastor stopped using a microphone and started hosting evenings of silence. In Los Angeles, a youth minister invited her students to sit in a circle and simply share what hurt in Cava. Bishop replaced his annual lecture with an evening of Eucharistic adoration and tears. Each credited Tagle, but he credited the gospel. It wasn't long before bishops began calling Rome not to question him, but to ask for him. Can he come here? They'd ask, can he speak to our seminarians? Can he lead a silent retreat? Pope Leo XIV. Hands clasped, eyes focused, listening intently. The caption read, simply, "He speaks our language." Within hours, it had traveled across continents for many Catholics, especially in the Middle Eastern parts of Europe. It was the first time they saw a church leader cross the boundary, not just a language, but belonging. Later, at an interfaith conference nearby, Tagle surprised everyone by opening his address in Hebrew, then Arabic, then Tagalog, before finishing in English. "I do not speak to impress," he said, "I speak to embrace." Because the word became flesh, and flesh has many voices. A room stood in stunned silence before erupting into a standing ovation. But he didn't stay for the applause that night. He returned to the shelter. No cameras followed him. He ate with the families, blessed the children, and prayed quietly in a corner. When asked why he came back, he replied, "Because they remember my name." In Nairobi, he visited a center for women recovering from abuse. It was not on any official church agenda. A group of young women, many survivors of domestic violence, gathered in a small hall. They had been told a guest would visit. They didn't expect a cardinal. When he arrived wearing a plain black shirt and weather-worn shoes, he simply sat on the floor. No platform, no fanfare. He asked them to tell him who they were before he told them who he was. One woman, scarred and silent, finally whispered, "What do you want from us?" Tagle looked at her and replied, "Nothing, but if you're willing, I'd like to carry part of your pain today." She covered her face and cried, and so did many others in Buenos Aires. He met with street children in a makeshift chapel beneath an abandoned train station. They had never been at catechism. They didn't know the Hail Mary, but they knew what it felt like to be forgotten. Tagle brought no books, no lesson plans. He sat on a concrete floor and listened to their dreams. One boy said, "I want to be a mechanic so I can fix broken engines." Tagle smiled and said, "That's good. The world needs people who can fix what others leave behind." The boy grinned. "Like you?" Tagle laughed gently. "Maybe, or maybe I'm just learning to fix hearts in South Korea." He joined a prayer group of elderly women who had not missed a single rosary. In 20 years their children had moved to the cities their husbands had long since died, but they met every Friday to pray for the world. When Tagle arrived, they offered him tea and rice cakes. He refused a chair prepared for him and sat beside them on the floor after the rosary. He said, "You are the lungs of the church you've been." Breathing for us all this time in a rural village in Pakistan, he visited a Christian community, living under threat. They had built their church from mud bricks and corrugated tin. He arrived without security, without spectacle. They sang hymns off-key, but full of faith. Afterward, the pastor handed him a small cross made from scraps of "Well, we want you to carry this." He said, "So you remember us?" Tagle pressed a cross to his lips and said, "You are not forgotten, I promise you that." Everywhere he went, the stories were the same people who had never met a cardinal, people who had stopped expecting Rome. To remember them, people whose faith had grown quiet under the weight of abandonment. And yet with one visit, one listening ear, one tear, they began to believe again, not in institutions, but in grace. He never asked them to return to the church. He didn't hand out pamphlets or talk about the sacraments. He simply stayed. And when he left behind something more lasting than theology. He left behind hope. A young priest in Vietnam, after accompanying Tagle on several visits, said, "He's not trying to convert them, he's trying to remember them, and that's what's bringing them back." Back in Rome, Pope Leo XIV received these stories with quiet gratitude. He kept a map on his wall with no pins or markers, only a candle burning. Beneath it, the gospel. He once said, "Travel's best when it walks," and that's what Tagle was doing, walking slowly, gently into places no one thought the church would ever return. And in doing so, he reminded the world of something it had nearly forgotten, that God is still among the least of lost. And the left behind, he had always believed that the church's most overlooked treasures were not stored in marble halls or Vatican archives. They were found in the wrinkled hands of the elderly, who had prayed quietly for decades, in the wide, searching eyes of children who asked questions too deep for theologians to answer. For Cardinal Tagle, the mission was never just about outreach. It was about remembering. And what he sought to remember above all was a forgotten wisdom and sacred innocence that still lived in those on society's edges, the old and the young. In a quiet parish in the suburb of Chicago, Tagle visited a community of older Catholics. Many were retired, some in wheelchairs, others relying on canes or the arms of adult children. They had gathered in a simple church basement for what they thought was just another diocese. An event. When Tagle entered, there was no announcement. He walked in slowly, carrying nothing but a small notebook and his rosary. He greeted each person by name as the pastor introduced them. "You remembered us?" One elderly woman asked, "How could I forget?" He answered, "You carried the faith longer than I've been alive." They sat in a circle. There was no agenda. Tagle invited them to speak, and they did, slowly at first, then with growing confidence. One man shared that he had taught confirmation classes for 30 years, only to see his grandchildren drift away from the church. "I wonder if any of it mattered." He said, "Tagle, lean forward. You planted seeds, some bloom. Quietly, some bloom late. But God sees them all." A woman, her voice trembling, said she still brought communion to the sick in her building, even though she could barely walk herself. "Now I'm the one waiting for someone to bring it to me," she added with a soft laugh. Tagle took her hand and said, "Even in your waiting, you're ministering, you're teaching us how to be faithful." The conversation shifted from loss to love, from disappointment to devotion. They spoke about hymns that had vanished, from liturgies of pain, of parishes closing, the loneliness that came with age. But as they spoke, something transformed the room. A kind of reverence settled in, not the kind born from status, but from shared memory. Tagle listened, as if each word was holy. He nodded, he smiled sometimes. He cried, "You are the church's memory," he said, "and memory is what saves us from losing ourselves." In Mexico City, he visited a hospice where a group of elderly religious sisters were spending their final years. One had served as a missionary in Bolivia. Another had taught generations of school children. Tagle entered their common room with no press, no ceremony. He sat beside a sister whose voice had faded from decades of use and listened as she recited prayers in a whisper. "I don't teach anymore," she said. "Now I just pray." Tagle placed his hand over hers. "Then you are now the teacher of heaven." In Los Angeles, he met a group of elderly Filipino immigrants who had built their parish community with their bare hands. After Mass, they served him pancit and rice cakes. One woman named Leticia told him she used to teach catechism in her village back home. "Now, I don't do much," she said. He smiled. "But you're still teaching." He replied, "You're teaching me right now." He never spoke to the elderly as if they were retired from faith. He spoke to them as prophets. "You are not just our past," he said. "Once you are our compass, you remind us where we came from and who we still are, yet his Mission was not only to the elders, he sought out the little ones too, not to preach, but to listen in a crowded school in Cebu. He knelt beside a child who had drawn a picture of a man holding a candle. "That's you." The girl said shyly, "Who's holding your hand?" He asked. She pointed to the second figure. "That's me," she said. "I am helping you not get lost." Tagle's voice caught. Then, "I am never alone in Germany." He sat with a group of children preparing for their first communion when one asked, "Does Jesus come if you forget a prayer?" Tagle smiled and said, "Jesus comes when you remember love. The prayers help, but the love brings him." In South Africa, he visited a center for street children. They didn't know what a cardinal was. They just knew he laughed easily and listened when they asked him questions. He didn't always have answers to why are some kids hungry and others not. Where does God sleep? Does he know my name? Instead of rushing to explain, Tagle sat beside them and whispered, "Yes, he knows her name, and he is listening to your questions even now." His ministry among the young wasn't flashy. He didn't run youth rallies or record videos for social media. He sat in circles. He drew with crayons. He wept when they shared their wounds. In Portugal, a teenage girl stood up at a youth retreat and said, "I want to believe, but I'm angry about the abuse, the hypocrisy, the silence." The room froze. Tagle didn't defend the church. He said, "Bring your anger. Don't let it grow alone. Let us carry it with you." The church cannot heal what she refuses to hear. In retreat after retreat, he found that what the young needed was not explanation, but encounter. They didn't want to be impressed. They wanted to be seen. In Korea, a boy said, "I'm too messy to be holy." Tagle laughed gently. God has always called messy people saints. Weren't perfect when they were chosen. They were just willing to be loved. By now word had spread, not because of articles, but because of hearts. Priests began inviting their elders to speak again. Youth groups started holding silent circles. Bishops created wisdom gatherings where the old and young could pray together. Tagle hadn't told anyone to do this. He had simply shown them how the mission, once considered vague and undefined, was becoming something unmistakable, not a program, not a ministry, a renewal of memory, and wonder held in the arms of the elderly and the voices of the young. In a letter to Pope Leo the first 14, Tagle wrote, "We often rush to the future, forgetting that those who have come before and those just arriving are the ones who carry us forward. I'm learning to walk more slowly, so I don't leave them behind." The Pope smiled as he read it. He had never expected a revolution of presence to come from formal structures. He had entrusted Tagle with the church's heart, and now the heart was beating in places Rome had not visited in years. One evening, in a small chapel in Vietnam, Tagle knelt in silence. Around him were elders and children praying side by side. Their voices were uneven, their candles flickered, but their faith was radiant as he whispered the final amen. He looked around and thought, this is the church, not perfect, not polished, but alive. And in that shared breath between generations, he saw something eternal. At first, it was barely noticeable, a shift in the air, a ripple in the rhythm of pastoral life. There were no trumpets, no declarations, no Vatican-approved slogans. But across dioceses, parishes, seminaries, and retreat centers, something was changing. And it didn't begin with strategy. It began with stillness. It began when a man with no titles and no programs started walking, listening, and weeping. What began in silence had started to spread, not like a storm, but like spring. In Belgium, a bishop who had once filled a schedule with meetings canceled a month's worth of administrative appointments. Instead, he visited hospitals and homes. I remembered what it felt like to be a priest again. He said he credited Cardinal Tagle in Manila. A group of young catechists began organizing what they called listening circles. Each week, they invited members of their community to gather in the church basement, not to be taught, but to be heard. At the center of each gathering was a single candle and a sign that read, "Speak, we're here." In Poland, seminary professors began asking their students not just to memorize dogma, but to write letters to people who had left the church, not to convince them, but to understand them. It was hard at first. One seminarian admitted, "But then I realized evangelization doesn't start with words, it starts with tears." Across the world, similar movements emerged. In Brazil, lay leaders reintroduced home visits, not to preach, but to listen to the sick. And lonely in Kenya, catechists gathered her students and said, "Today we learn about God's mercy by listening to one another's stories." In France, a diocese quietly launched a pastoral initiative called the Tagle Hour. Once a week, priests sat in the church not to hear confessions, not to lead devotions, but to be available for conversation. One man walked in and told me he hadn't spoken to a priest in 30 years. A parish priest shared he didn't need a sacrament. He needed someone to sit with him. None of these efforts had come from a Vatican directive. There were no official documents or grants. They came because someone had shown them. That ministry was less about method and more about mercy. The church wasn't moving faster. It was moving deeper. Cardinal Tagle continued his journey unaware of how wide the echo had become. He moved from continent to continent, always by invitation, never by schedule in Sudan. He sat in silence with teachers who hadn't been paid in months in Slovakia. He peeled potatoes with novices in a convent kitchen in Japan. He prayed in candlelight with descendants of underground Catholics who had kept their faith hidden for generations in each place. He said little, but when he spoke, people leaned in, not because his words were powerful, but because his silence had already spoken in a village outside Warsaw. An elderly man walked up to him after a small prayer service and said, "I left the church decades ago, but when I saw you weep during the Eucharistic prayer, I remembered what it used to feel like to believe." The Pope followed all of this not through reports, but through the stories passed. From one soul to another, he read letters, he heard testimonies. He watched as bishops began requesting Tagle's presence not to deliver lectures, but to help them. Remember how to see again. Pope Leo XIV had not created a committee, he had entrusted a witness, and that witness was awakening the church one hidden fire at a time. In the Philippines, Tagle returned briefly to visit his childhood parish. He spent hours in the chapel head, bowed his rosary beads running slowly through his fingers outside. Word spread that he was home, but he didn't call the press or organize a mass. He simply sat with people, old neighbors, altar servers, market vendors. One woman approached him and said, "You're still our shepherd." He smiled. "I never stopped being yours." Even in places where faith had grown cold, something was shifting. In Lisbon, a teenage girl who had not been to church in years attended a candlelight prayer service. When asked why she came, she said, "Because he doesn't speak like a priest, he speaks like someone who has cried like me." In Cameroon, a young seminarian began translating part of Tagle's talks into local dialects. "They need to hear this," he said. Not his theology, his tone back in Rome. Pope Leo XIV continued his quiet governance. He didn't call for a new encyclical. He didn't restructure the dicasteries. He simply lit a candle each night in his private chapel and prayed, "Lord, let the fire grow." It was the same prayer he had whispered when he first called Tagle back, not to prominence, but to presence. One evening, as the Pope read a letter from a missionary in Colombia, he paused at a single sentence. He didn't give us tools. He gave us time. The Pope closed his eyes and breathed deeply. That was the heart of it. In an era of instant communication, an instant judgment, the church was learning to take time again, to sit, to stay, to accompany, and it was changing everything. In Australia, a pastor who had grown disillusioned by clerical scandals began meeting with abuse survivors once a week, not to defend the church, but to ask forgiveness. In Canada, a group of young adults started gathering at sunrise to pray for the healing of the church. One of them said, "We're not waiting for Rome, we're starting here." And in every story, every whisper, Cardinal Tagle's name appeared not as a hero, but as a flame. He hadn't restored the church by force. He had reminded it of its soul. He hadn't built a movement. He had moved hearts. In the chapel of Santa Maria in TRSTV, Tagle returned after weeks on the road. He sat in the back pew just as he had always done. The church was nearly empty. A few candles flickered. A young woman entered quietly and sat near him. She didn't recognize him at first, but then she saw the bracelet on his wrist, a child's hand-woven gift from Uganda. Her eyes widened. "Are you?" He smiled. "I'm just someone who came to pray." She nodded. "I'm glad you're here." So was the church, not because he had solved its problems, but because he had walked with its people, and in doing so, he helped the gospel breathe again, not with thunder, but with tenderness. The sun had barely risen when Cardinal Tagle stepped into St. Peter's Square once more. The cobblestones beneath his feet were wet with the dew of dawn, and the air held that particular silence only Rome knows before it fully wakes. He walked slowly, not toward the center, but along the colonnade, unnoticed by tourists just beginning to gather. No cameras followed him, no aides accompanied him. He walked not as a prince of the church, but as a pilgrim returning to heart a mission that had never truly been his. It had always belonged to someone greater. Months had passed since the Pope called him back in silence. Since then the world had changed, but not in the way newspapers measure. There were no sweeping decrees or thunderous councils, yet from the Philippines to France, from Brazil to benign hearts were stirring in chapels, in alleyways and broken parishes, and worn-out priests. Something had reignited, and it all came down to what he carried, not doctrine, but presents. That morning, Pope Leo XV invited him to breakfast in a small room overlooking the gardens. The table was plain bread, fruit, 2 cups of warm coffee. They spoke quietly like old friends. A Pope, older now, his voice slower, but still full of fire, leaned forward and said, "Louis the First sent you to listen to the world, but I think you brought something back from heaven." Tagle shook his head humbly. Holiness, I only stayed where people needed someone not to leave. The Pope smiled. That's what shepherds do. They talk to the places. He had been to the refugee shelter in Lisbon, where children called him Uncle Luis, or the elderly nuns in Mexico, who had kissed his hands, and whispered that he was an answer to prayer of the boy in a fla, who gave him a plastic flower, and said, "This is for your altar." The story spilled like beads from a rosary, one holy memory after another. The Pope listened, his eyes misting. "You did not go to preach," he said. "You went to stay." That is the gospel. Later that day, Tagle wandered the Vatican gardens, passing statues of saints and olive trees centuries old. He paused beneath one and sat on a stone bench, his fingers tracing the wooden cross he carried in his pocket. It was worn smooth in the hands of a Sudan woman who had lost her family, and handed it to him in silence, saying only, "Let this remind you that love survives." He had carried it ever since. As he sat in prayer, a group of seminarians passed by. They stopped, recognizing him, unsure whether to approach. One stepped forward and said, "Your Eminence, I want to thank you. I was going to leave the seminary last year. I thought I couldn't be holy enough. Then I saw a video of you fixing a woman's broken rosary, tying the beads back together with string. I realized holiness doesn't mean being loud, it means being loved." Tagle smiled, touched the young man's shoulder, and said, "Then you already know the most important lesson." He returned to his room that evening, the same one where he had first stayed after the conclave when he had not been chosen. Sacked in the air, it felt heavy with disappointment, though he never showed it. But now the room felt different, not forgotten, but reborn. On his small desk sat his journal, its pages full of names, tears, blessing stories that had no beginning and no ending, only grace. He turned to the final page and wrote, "God does not ask me to be loud, he asks me to be light." As darkness fell, he lit a candle by the window. No one else saw it, but in that flickering glow was everything: the prayers of the poor, the sighs of the weary, the hidden yes of those who had said yes to God without ever being noticed. The flame danced steady and warm, a reminder that nothing holy is ever lost. Word began to circulate in Vatican circles. Cardinal Tagle would speak again, not from a grand stage, not in a televised address, but in a small chapel behind the colonnade, a quiet gathering of young priests from across the world. There was no announcement, no media coverage, just whispers, and that was enough to fill the pews. He entered with no script, no mitre, no fanfare. He sat on a simple chair facing the room, fell silent. After a long pause, he began, "I used to be afraid of silence. I thought it meant I had nothing to offer, but now I know silence is where love enters a wound without tearing it further." He looked around, his voice softer now. "Many of you will preach with words, but the world is waiting to be loved in stillness. Preach, by staying, preach, by listening, preach, by walking the road no one else wants to take." One priest asked, "And if no one notices?" Tagle's eyes filled, "And heaven will. And sometimes that's the only applause that matters." He closed his eyes and added, "And if you can love like that, you will never be forgotten." There was no applause when he finished, just tears, silent ones, because they had seen in him something. They had longed to believe that holiness is possible, that gentleness is strength, and that God still walks quietly among his people. Later that week, as Teal prepared to return to the Philippines, someone asked if he felt vindicated. He smiled. "Vindication belongs to God. I'm just grateful the fire is still lit." He boarded the plane without ceremony, just another traveler with a worn bag and a full heart. But wherever he went, candles were burning, left in chapels, placed on altars, hidden in kitchen windows. People lit them not because they had met him, but because they had felt the love he left behind. And that was the real miracle. The fire had not been started with matches. It had begun with mercy. It was not stoked by press or power, but by presence, and it would not go out, not as long as there were hands to carry it, tears of water, and hearts willing to stay in every place where it stepped. Slums, cathedrals, refugee tents, seminaries, nursing homes. The church had remembered how to breathe, not with noise, but with nearness, not with strength, but with softness, not with certainty, but with surrender. The flame burned on quiet, hidden unseen by many, but never by heaven. You've stayed with us and are listening to our story. We're truly grateful. We hope to bring you a blessed day and send you our warmest wishes from the Lord and Pope Leo the first 14. Join us as we uncover the powerful message in the next part of the story. And don't forget to subscribe and leave your wonderful comment below. Thank you so much.